The house was silent the morning after Sarah's confession, the kind of silence that seeps into your bones and makes every sound feel amplified. I sat at the edge of our bed, my elbows on my knees, staring at the floor. The carpet beneath my feet was soft, its beige fibers tangled from years of use. I had never noticed it before, not like this, how it cushioned every step, muted every movement. Now even the mundane felt sharp, as though my senses were tuned to the frequency of betrayal. She had left early, claiming she needed time to clear her head. Her absence should have been a relief, but it only deepened the void in the room. My mind replayed our confrontation from the night before, the way her voice had cracked when she tried to explain, the tears pooling in her eyes as she admitted to the affair. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she had said, her hands clutching at the edges of the dining table as if it could anchor her. "I didn't mean for it to happen." I had remained silent, my arms crossed tightly across my chest, every muscle coiled. What could I say? That I understood, that I forgave her? The words wouldn't come, and in their place, a cold, seething anger settled like a stone in my gut. Hours passed before I moved from the bed. The weight of inaction was suffocating, and I needed to do something, anything, to reclaim a sense of control. I found myself in the small home office we had shared for years, the walls lined with bookshelves and the desk cluttered with receipts, notebooks, and pens that had long since run out of ink. Her laptop sat on the desk, its sleek black surface, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding it. I opened it again, my hands steady this time, and began to dig deeper. If there was more to uncover, I needed to know. The photos and messages I had found the day before had been a blow, but they hadn't told the whole story. I needed to understand the scope of her betrayal. Was it just one person? How long had it been going on? What lies had she told to cover her tracks? The folder marked Work Documents was only the beginning. As I scrolled through her emails, calendar appointments, and social media messages, a timeline began to take shape. The affair had started nearly 5 years ago, with a man named Daniel, a name that felt foreign and venomous on my tongue. He was a colleague, someone she had met during a business trip to Chicago. The messages between them were intimate, filled with inside jokes, shared memories, and a passion that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I leaned back in the chair, the screen's glow casting shadows across the room. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, sadness, humiliation. But beneath it all, a seed of something darker began to take root, a desire for retribution. She shattered our life together, I thought, my jaw tightening. She doesn't get to walk away unscathed. The idea was faint at first, a whisper at the edge of my consciousness. But the more I dwelled on it, the clearer it became. I wouldn't confront her again, not yet. Instead, I would gather my strength, plan my next move. If she had spent years deceiving me, I could afford to take my time. Patience, I realized, could be my greatest weapon. Over the next few days, I began to orchestrate my revenge with meticulous care. My first step was to learn everything I could about Daniel. He was married with 2 young children, a fact that only deepened my disdain for him. Through social media and public records, I pieced together his life, his career, his hobbies, his family. Every detail was another thread in the web I was weaving. At the same time, I started documenting everything, every text, email, and photo that proved their affair. I created a digital archive stored on a flash drive that I kept hidden in the false bottom of my desk drawer. If Sarah or Daniel ever tried to deny their actions, I would have the evidence to expose them. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Each morning I greeted Sarah with a hollow smile, my voice calm and measured. She seemed grateful for the illusion of peace, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. At night, as she lay beside me in bed, I would stare at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. What would hurt her the most, I wondered. The question consumed me, and the answers came in flashes. Visions of public humiliation, legal, battles, shattered reputations. But none of them felt quite right. I didn't just want to hurt her. I wanted her to understand the depth of my pain, to feel the weight of her choices bearing down on her like an unforgiving tide. The breakthrough came one evening as I sat in the living room scrolling through Daniel's Facebook profile. His wife, a woman named Emily, appeared in nearly every photo, her smile radiant and genuine. She had no idea what was happening behind her back. No inkling of the betrayal that had infiltrated her marriage. The minutes stretched into hours, then into a day, and still no reply came from Emily. Each time my phone buzzed, my pulse quickened, but it was never her. A notification from the news app, a text from an old college friend, a spam email offering, a discount on car insurance. By the second day, doubt began to creep in. What if she doesn't believe me? What if she just deletes the message without even looking at it? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more frustrating than the last. But no matter how many scenarios I played out in my head, I knew I couldn't undo what I had done. The truth was out there now, waiting to be acknowledged. On the evening of the third day, my phone vibrated on the coffee table as I sat in the living room, staring blankly at the muted television. I reached for it with a mix of hope and dread. When I saw her name, Emily Daniels, illuminating the screen, my breath hitched. Her message was short, but its tone carried a weight I recognized all too well. "I've read your message. Can we talk? Please call me." My hands were clammy as I dialed her number. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice shaky but resolute. "Hello?" she said, her words clipped. "Is this—" "Yes," I replied, my throat tight. "It's me. I wasn't sure if you'd respond." There was a pause on the other end, filled with the muffled sound of her breathing. When she spoke again, her voice was laced with restrained anger. "I need to know everything. Don't leave anything out." For the next hour, I told her everything I knew. I described how I had discovered Sarah's affair, the evidence I had found, and the timeline I had pieced together. I could hear the pain in her voice as she asked question after question, each one pulling another thread from the fabric of her world. "How long have you known?" she asked at one point, her voice trembling. "About a month," I admitted, feeling a pang of guilt. "But I wasn't sure how to approach you. I didn't want to hurt you more than necessary." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Hurt me? You think this doesn't hurt already? God, I don't even know what to do with this." "I understand," I said softly, though the words felt hollow. Did I truly understand? Could anyone? Unless they had lived through this? Silence fell between us, heavy and suffocating. Then she spoke again, her voice hardening. "We need to meet, face to face. I want to see the evidence myself." "Of course," I agreed without hesitation. "When and where?" We decided to meet the following evening at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, a neutral ground where we could talk without fear of being overheard. I arrived early, the flash drive containing all the evidence tucked securely in my pocket. My heart pounded as I waited, each passing minute stretching my nerves thinner. When Emily walked in, I recognized her immediately from the photos. She was petite, with dark brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail and tired eyes that betrayed a sleepless night. She wore a simple navy coat, her posture rigid as she scanned the room. When our eyes met, she hesitated for a moment before walking over to my table. "Emily," I said, standing to greet her. "Thank you for coming." She nodded curtly, her expression guarded. I almost didn't. We sat across from each other, the small table feeling like a chasm. For a moment, neither of us spoke. the weight of the situation pressing down on us. Finally, I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and placed it on the table. "Everything is on here," I said, sliding it toward her. "Messages, photos, emails. I wanted you to have it, so you can make your own decisions." Emily stared at the drive as if it were a venomous snake. Her hands remained in her lap, clenched tightly together. "Do you hate her?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Did I hate Sarah? The woman I had loved, shared a life with and trusted implicitly? The answer wasn't as simple as I wanted it to be. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I hate what she's done. I hate how she's made me feel. But hate her? I don't know." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded slowly. "I think I hate him," she said, her voice breaking. "But I still love him. Too. Isn't that pathetic?" "No," I said firmly. "It's human." We talked for hours that night, sharing our pain, our doubts, and our fears. Emily told me about her life with Daniel, the good times, the struggles, the moments that now felt tainted. In turn, I shared my story, laying bare the betrayal that had upended my world. By the time we parted ways, there was an unspoken understanding between us. We were both victims in this tangled web, and while we couldn't undo the damage, we could help each other find a way forward. Emily promised to confront Daniel, and I assured her I would do the same with Sarah. The confrontation with Sarah wasn't something I had planned meticulously, but the weight of betrayal demanded action. As I stepped into the house that evening, the familiar scents and sights felt alien, like I was walking into someone else's life. The photos of us on the walls, the souvenirs from our vacations, even the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, they all seemed to mock me. Sarah was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her face lighting up in a smile that now felt like a mask. "You're home early," she said, setting the book down. Her voice was casual, but I detected a flicker of tension in her eyes. Or maybe I was imagining it. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice steady but firm. I didn't sit down, didn't take off my coat. The distance between us felt symbolic, a gulf I wasn't sure we could bridge. She tilted her head, her expression shifting to one of mild concern. "What's wrong?" The words were caught in my throat for a moment. How do you confront someone you've loved for a decade with the knowledge of their betrayal? But then I remembered the photos, the messages, the lies, and the anger gave me strength. "Are you having an affair?" I asked bluntly, my eyes locked on hers. The color drained from her face. For a moment, she just stared at me, her lips parting as if to deny it, but no words came. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "Why would you even ask that?" she finally managed, her voice trembling. "Because I know," I said, pulling out my phone. I opened the folder containing the evidence, turned the screen toward her, and watched as her face crumpled under the weight of undeniable proof. "I've known for weeks, Sarah. I wanted to believe it wasn't true, but here it is. All of it." Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. I can explain," she stammered, her voice breaking. I laughed bitterly. "Explain? Go ahead, Sarah. Explain how you've been lying to me for years. Explain how you've been sharing parts of yourself with someone else while pretending to love me." "It's not like that," she said, her words rushing out in a desperate plea. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something you didn't mean. This is a choice. A series of choices. You didn't trip and fall into an affair, Sarah. You made this happen." Tears streamed down her face, but I felt no sympathy. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Who is he?" I demanded. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, and that hesitation was an answer in itself. Finally, she whispered a name I already knew. Daniel, Emily's husband. 2 years, she admitted, her voice barely audible. 2 years. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. While I had been planning vacations, celebrating anniversaries, and believing in us, she had been carrying on with someone else. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. We argued for hours that night, the conversation swinging wildly between anger, denial, and sorrow. She apologized repeatedly, begged for forgiveness, but her words felt hollow. Every "I'm sorry" only reminded me of the trust she had shattered. By the time the sun rose, we were both emotionally drained. She sat slumped on the couch, her face streaked with tears, while I stood by the window, staring out at the pale light of dawn. "I need time," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "Time to figure out what's next. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah. I don't even know if I want to try." She nodded silently, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. In the weeks that followed, life became a series of difficult decisions. Sarah moved out temporarily, giving me space to think. I threw myself into work, into anything that would distract me from the hollow ache in my chest. Friends and family offered support, but their well-meaning words often felt like salt in the wound. Emily and I kept in touch sporadically, each update a reminder of the tangled web we were both trying to navigate. She had confronted Daniel, and their relationship was now in a state of limbo, much like mine with Sarah. One evening, Emily and I met again, this time at a park. The air was crisp, the scent of autumn leaves heavy in the air. We walked in silence for a while before she spoke. "Do you think people like them ever really change?" she asked, her voice tinged with sadness. I thought about her question for a long moment. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know that we don't have to let their choices define us. We deserve better than this." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "It's hard, though, letting go." "It is," I agreed. "But maybe it's the only way to find peace." In the end, the journey toward healing was a solitary one. In the weeks that followed Sarah's departure, the house grew quieter. Not peaceful, just quiet, like the air in the aftermath of a storm. I kept expecting her voice to cut through the silence, a laugh, a greeting, even the soft hum of her favorite song. But it never came. The absence was its own kind of presence, oppressive and constant. I spent hours replaying our relationship in my mind, combing through years of memories for signs I had missed, clues I should have seen. Were the late nights at work always just work? Was her smile less genuine than I believed? The questions gnawed at me, their answers elusive and unsatisfying. It wasn't long before the anger set in, a hot pulsing fury that simmered beneath the surface of every thought. I wasn't just angry at Sarah. I was angry at myself for trusting her, for not seeing what was right in front of me. And I was angry at him, Daniel, the man who had taken what wasn't his to take. The thought of him was like a splinter under my skin. He had not only betrayed his wife, but had encroached on my life, on my marriage, as if it were his right. I pictured him smirking, smug in the belief that he had gotten away with it. The image fanned the flames of my resentment into something sharper, something darker. I started watching him, not in an obsessive way, at least not at first. It began as curiosity. I needed to see him, to understand who he was and why Sarah had been drawn to him. What did he have that I didn't? Daniel worked at a mid-sized law firm downtown. It wasn't hard to find out. A few minutes of online searching yielded his office address, his work schedule, even a picture of him at a firm gala, all polished smiles and tailored suits. He looked every bit the part of a man who thought he could have it all. The first time I saw him in person, he was coming out of his office building, briefcase in hand. He looked just like his pictures, tall, clean-cut, exuding confidence. He wore his success like armor, his steps brisk and purposeful. I stood across the street, hidden in the crowd, and watched as he disappeared into a sleek black car. The sight of him, so composed and unbothered, sparked something in me. He didn't look like a man weighed down by guilt. He looked like a man who had faced no consequences. The idea of revenge came slowly, like a whisper in the back of my mind, that grew louder with each passing day. It wasn't just about him. It was about me. About reclaiming the power I felt I had lost. If he could live his life unscathed, then where was the justice in that? I didn't want violence. That wasn't who I was. But I wanted him to feel what I felt, the sting of betrayal, the weight of humiliation. I wanted him to lose the sense of control he seemed to hold so tightly. So I began to plan. Carefully, methodically. If I was going to do this, it had to be precise, clean, and untraceable. Step 1 was information. I spent hours piecing together the details of Daniel's life, social media accounts, public records, even casual mentions from Emily during our conversations. It all painted a picture of a man who thrived on appearances. His career, his social circle, his meticulously curated image, it was all about perception. Step 2 was leverage. It wasn't enough to disrupt his life. I needed to expose him for what he was. I needed evidence, something undeniable that would shatter the facade he had built. I found it in the form of an affair he was having outside, of his relationship with Sarah. It was almost laughable. The man who had already stolen my wife couldn't even keep his own infidelity contained. A few strategic online searches, combined with discreet observation, confirmed it. Daniel wasn't just cheating with Sarah. He had another mistress, a younger woman he visited regularly under the guise of business trips. Step 3 was execution. I created an anonymous email account and composed a message that contained everything I had gathered: photos of him with the mistress, screenshots of their messages, and details about their meetings. I made sure the email was sent to all the right people: his boss, his colleagues, his friends, and most importantly, Emily. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Within days, whispers of scandal swirled around his workplace. His pristine reputation began to crack as colleagues distanced themselves and clients pulled out of deals. Emily, armed with the evidence I had provided, filed for divorce and moved out of their home. For a man like Daniel, who thrived on control and status, the collapse of his carefully constructed world was devastating, and I felt no pity for him. In the aftermath, I found an unexpected sense of closure. It wasn't about ruining Daniel's life. It was about reclaiming mine. For the first time in months, I felt like I had taken control of my narrative, like I was no longer a victim of someone else's choices. Sarah reached out to me once after the dust had settled. The days following Daniel's fall felt like the calm after a thunderstorm, a surreal mix of stillness and clarity, though punctuated by lingering echoes of what had happened. The satisfaction I'd initially felt began to fade, replaced by an odd sense of emptiness. The revenge had been executed perfectly, its results undeniable, but it hadn't restored what was lost. It hadn't filled the gaping hole that Sarah's betrayal had left in my life. I turned inward, trying to reconcile the man I was before this, or deal with the man I was becoming. What did I want for myself now? Revenge had been a temporary salve, but the deeper wounds, those required more than vengeance to heal. The turning point came one late evening when I received a message from Emily, Daniel's now ex-wife. I'd expected anger or bitterness, but her tone surprised me. "I know what you did," she wrote. "Thank you, but I'd like to talk." Curiosity overrode caution, and I agreed to meet her. We chose a small cafe, tucked away on a quiet street, a place where neither of us would feel exposed. When she arrived, I was struck by her composure. Emily was elegant but not ostentatious. Her demeanor, calm yet commanding. She wore her heartbreak differently than I had. Where I had unraveled, she had armored herself. Her first words set the tone for our conversation. "I don't blame you," she said, her voice steady. "In fact, I think I owe you. You gave me the truth I needed to move on." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Her gratitude was unexpected, and it left me slightly off balance. "But," she continued, her gaze locking onto mine, "I can't help but wonder, what did you lose in the process?" Her question lingered in the air between us, heavier than I anticipated. What had I lost? A decade-long marriage, trust, a sense of stability, all of it was gone. But as I looked at Emily, I realized that I had also lost something far more personal, myself. Our conversation stretched into hours, a surprising and candid exchange between two people who had been collateral damage in the same war. Emily shared her own story, the slow unraveling of her marriage, the countless signs she'd ignored, and the moment she'd decided enough was enough. In turn, I told her about Sarah, about the years I had spent blind to the truth, about the fury that had driven me to act. Revenge felt right in the moment, I admitted, swirling the coffee in my cup. But now, I'm not so sure. I'm left wondering if it changed anything at all. Emily's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "It changed everything for me," she said. "It gave me a way out, and for that I'm grateful. But for you, maybe it's just the beginning." I didn't fully grasp the weight of her words until much later. But they planted a seed, a notion that perhaps this wasn't the end of my story, but the start of a new one. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. I started small, tackling the practicalities, sorting through the house, removing traces of Sarah's presence, creating a space that felt like mine again. The process was painful but necessary, each box packed and each room rearranged, a step toward reclaiming my autonomy. But healing wasn't just about physical spaces. I delved into my own mind, confronting the emotions I had buried beneath the drive for revenge. I sought therapy, a decision I had once scoffed at but now embraced. My therapist, a perceptive and kind woman named Dr. Patel, guided me through the labyrinth of my feelings: grief, anger, betrayal, and, surprisingly, guilt. "You feel guilty for seeking revenge," she observed during one session, her tone neutral. "Why?" I hesitated before answering, struggling to articulate the tangled web of my thoughts. "Because it didn't fix anything," I said finally. "It didn't make me feel better. If anything, it just left me hollow." Dr. Patel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Revenge often feels satisfying in the short term because it gives us a sense of control," she explained. "But true healing comes from within, not from the harm we inflict on others. The question is, how do you want to move forward?" Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. How did I want to move forward? What kind of man did I want to be on the other side of this? The answer began to take shape in unexpected ways. I threw myself into activities that had once brought me joy, but had been neglected over the years. I picked up my old guitar, its strings rusty but still capable of producing music that resonated with my soul. I joined a local hiking group, finding solace in the rhythm of my footsteps against the earth and the vast open spaces that stretched out before me. I also reached out to old friends, people I had distanced myself from during my marriage. Their warmth and support reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my identity wasn't solely defined by the pain I had endured. And then there was Emily. The investigation began the moment I closed her laptop and took a deep breath, the weight of what I'd uncovered pressing heavily on my chest. The evidence was damning but incomplete, a series of snapshots and messages that hinted at a larger story, one I was determined to uncover in its entirety. There was no longer room for doubt. I needed clarity, not just for my sanity, but for the justice I owed myself. The first step was to identify the other man. The messages in Sarah's hidden folder were filled with vague references, affectionate nicknames, and plans that didn't reveal much about his identity. "See you at the usual spot," one text read. Another mentioned a gift, but there were no names, no solid clues, just a trail of breadcrumbs leading to nowhere. I turned my focus to her phone, which she guarded closely, never leaving it unattended. That evening, as she showered, I seized the opportunity. My hands trembled as I unlocked it using the code I'd memorized long ago. I scrolled through her messages, her call logs, her social media, all the places people tend to leave digital footprints. And there it was, a number saved under a generic name, Mark T. It stood out because there were no other marks in her. Contacts and the conversations were sparse, as if curated to avoid suspicion. But a closer inspection of her call history revealed that Mark T was anything but insignificant. Late-night calls, lengthy conversations during work hours, and texts at odd intervals painted a picture I couldn't ignore. The next step was reconnaissance. I wanted to know who this Mark T was and how deep their connection ran. I hired a private investigator, a decision I wrestled with but ultimately justified as a necessity. The man I hired, a seasoned professional named Greg, listened patiently as I laid out the situation. His demeanor was calm and professional, his questions sharp and to the point. "Do you want confirmation, or do you want the full picture?" he asked, his pen poised over a notepad. "The full picture," I replied without hesitation. "I need to know everything." Greg nodded, his expression unreadable. "It'll take time, but I'll get you what you need." The days that followed were a study in patience and endurance. Sarah's behavior remained unchanged, effortlessly deceptive, her routine a seamless blend of normalcy and lies. She kissed me goodbye in the mornings, texted me during the day, and sat across from me at dinner as if nothing was amiss. It was infuriating and surreal, like living in a parallel reality where only I knew the truth. Greg's updates trickled in sporadically, each one a piece of the puzzle. Mark T, as it turned out, was a co-worker, a man Sarah had worked with for years. Greg's surveillance revealed meetings at discreet locations, a quiet cafe, a secluded park, even a hotel on one occasion. The photos he provided were damning. Sarah leaning into Mark's embrace, their heads close as they shared private conversations, their hands brushing in ways that spoke volumes. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that stung. It was the emotional intimacy they shared, the way she smiled at him, the way her body language softened in his presence. It was a version of her I hadn't seen in years, and it left me questioning everything about our relationship. One evening, Greg handed me a thick envelope containing his findings. "This is everything," he said. "I've done my part. What you do next is up to you." I thanked him, though the words felt hollow. The envelope sat on my desk for hours before I mustered the courage to open it. Inside were photographs, transcripts of conversations Greg had managed to obtain, and a detailed timeline of their interactions. Each page was a blow, a painful confirmation of what I already knew but had hoped wasn't true. As I pored over the evidence, a new emotion began to take root, a quiet, simmering resolve. Sarah had built a web of lies, but now I held the threads in my hands. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about accountability, about ensuring that she faced the consequences of her actions. The confrontation came sooner than I anticipated. Sarah arrived home late one evening, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her demeanor casual. I waited until she had settled into the living room before I spoke. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She looked up, her expression a mix of curiosity and mild concern. "What's wrong?" I held up the envelope. its weight symbolic of the burden I'd carried. "This," I said simply. "I know everything, Sarah." Her face paled, her composure cracking for the first time. She stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice wavering. I placed the envelope on the coffee table between us, its contents spilling slightly as I opened it. The photographs, the transcripts, the damning evidence. It was all there, laid bare for her to see. Title: The Enigma of Affection, A Tale of Betrayal and Redemption. In the sleepy town of Valeshire, nestled between rolling hills and mist-laden forests, lived a man named Edward. He had spent the better part of his life wrapped in the routine, comforts of family life, with a wife, a daughter, and the sense of contentment that many envied. But what few knew was that beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect existence, a storm was brewing, one of love, betrayal, and a haunting question. What is the true nature of affection? Edward had married Charlotte when they were both in their 20s. She was the daughter of a successful businessman, graceful and beautiful, with eyes that could light up the darkest rooms. Their union had been one forged by mutual respect and affection, a partnership where they balanced each other's strengths and weaknesses. At least that's how it appeared on the outside. However, over the years, as time wore on and life's demands began to pile up, their once vibrant connection began to fade. Charlotte, ever so preoccupied with her social status and maintaining the perfect image, had drifted away from the very values that had first brought them together. She became distant, aloof, wrapped in the pursuit of wealth and recognition, leaving Edward in the shadows of her ambitions. Enter Beatrice, Charlotte's mother, a woman who was as different from her daughter as the moon is from the sun. Beatrice had been a source of strength and wisdom, a woman who had experienced life's trials with grace and resilience. She was the embodiment of unconditional love, a constant reminder to Edward of what true care and affection felt like. Unlike Charlotte, Beatrice was grounded, humble, and always made time to listen, to nurture, and to offer a kind word when the world seemed too harsh. At first, it was nothing more than a few innocent conversations. Edward, weary from the lack of emotional connection at home, found solace in Beatrice's words. She would visit often, and over time their bond deepened. It was as though with every passing day, he began to rediscover what it was to feel seen, to feel valued, to feel loved. Not as an accessory to a perfect image, but as a human being with a heart capable of longing, pain, and hope. But it was not long before those innocent conversations turned into something more. One evening, after Charlotte had left for a business trip, Edward and Beatrice found themselves alone by the fire. The warmth of the flames cast flickering shadows across the room, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Perhaps it was the vulnerability they both shared, or perhaps it was the undeniable magnetic pull that had built up over time. What started as an innocent touch lingered, and before they knew it, they were entwined in a passionate affair, the very nature of which both terrified and exhilarated them. The guilt, however, began to gnaw at Edward's conscience. He loved his wife. And yet, he couldn't deny the feelings that had blossomed for Beatrice. The complexity of his emotions consumed him. He was torn between the woman who had once been his love and the woman who now made him feel whole in a way he hadn't in years. Months passed, and the affair continued in secret. Yet the tension between Edward and Charlotte grew palpable. Charlotte, ever the keen observer, noticed the subtle shifts, his distracted gaze, his distant demeanor. She, too, felt a void, though she was too entrenched in her own world to recognize its cause. But she wasn't blind. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with Edward, she discovered the truth. It was not just the affair that shattered her. It was the realization that the one person who had truly cared for her husband, who had truly given him the love he had craved, was her own mother. Charlotte's reaction was not one of immediate fury, but rather a cold, calculated silence. The betrayal, she felt, was not just against her, but against her own flesh and blood. Beatrice, the woman who had taught her the values of love, was now the very source of its destruction. The complexity of the situation crushed Charlotte's spirit, leaving her isolated in her own grief and anger. Edward, though caught in a whirlwind of his own guilt, knew that he had crossed a line that could never be undone. Yet the pain of losing both women, the woman who had been his partner in life and the one who had given him a second chance at love, was unbearable. It was a darkness from which he could not escape. In the days that followed, Beatrice vanished from their lives, slipping away like a shadow fading at dawn. She left behind only a letter, written with the same grace that had always defined her. Love, dear Edward, is a gift, not a possession. You must find the courage to choose the path that heals, not the one that wounds. I will always love you, but my love for you will never outweigh the love I have for my daughter. The taste of revenge, a tale of retribution and regret. In the wake of the affair, the quiet town of Valeshire seemed to hold its breath, as though it too could sense the tension that had fallen over the lives of those entangled in this web of betrayal. Edward, once a man who had taken pride in his integrity, now stood at the precipice of a darkness he never imagined he could enter. His heart ached not just with regret, but with the simmering rage of a man who had been wronged by the very woman he had promised to love forever. Charlotte, in her quiet devastation, had retreated from both him and her mother. Her world had crumbled, and she was left to grapple with the bitter reality that the love she had devoted herself to had been stolen from her, not by some stranger, but by the one person who should have stood beside her, her own flesh and blood. Yet in the depth of her fury and heartbreak, something within Charlotte began to change. The woman who had once been focused solely on maintaining appearances, on the outward image of perfection, now began to harbor a darker, more dangerous side. The ache of betrayal, twisted into something more sinister, began to stir within her, an urge for vengeance that burned hotter than her grief. It was not long before she realized what needed to be done. The first step, she knew, was to separate herself from Edward, but not simply in the physical sense. Charlotte began to unravel the very foundation of the life they had built together. She began to sell their assets, liquidating their shared investments, dismantling the facade of their marriage with a precision that only a woman scorned could possess. No longer did she wear the crown of the dutiful wife. She donned the armor of a queen who would fight for her dignity, no matter the cost. Beatrice, meanwhile, had taken refuge far away, retreating into the solitude of her own home, far from the storm she had ignited. She had told herself that she was doing what was best for everyone, that leaving was the only way to protect her daughter, to shield Edward from further harm. But in her heart, she too was consumed by guilt. She had betrayed her own blood, and the weight of it pressed down on her every waking moment. The tension built in the silence, each person simmering in their own anguish. Charlotte, however, had been playing a quiet game. She had no intention of letting either Edward or Beatrice off so easily. Her plan, as cunning as it was, would see that her suffering was avenged. She sought out the most influential people in town, those who could help her exact her retribution, those who had ties to the world of business, wealth, and influence. She made her move with careful deliberation, planting seeds of doubt about Edward's integrity, spreading rumors of his affair, and presenting herself as the wronged woman who had been cast aside by both her husband and her mother. Her manipulation was subtle, but it was enough. Edward, once admired in Valeshire for his business acumen and personal integrity, began to see cracks form in his reputation. Contracts were revoked, partnerships dissolved, and the whispers about his affair, about his moral failings, became louder. The business that had once thrived under his leadership now began to falter, and he felt the cold sting of every betrayal now laid bare before him. But Charlotte's revenge did not stop there. No, she had one more card to play, the final blow that would not only hurt Edward, but also destroy the last remnants of the bond between mother and daughter. She reached out to the few remaining allies Beatrice had left in the town, including some of the friends who had once been close to the family. She made sure that they knew of her mother's actions, that Beatrice had destroyed their family, and that she had broken the trust that had held them all together. She portrayed herself as the innocent victim, left in the wake of a mother who had betrayed everything for the sake of passion. The fallout from Charlotte's vengeance was catastrophic. Beatrice, once beloved by all, now found herself abandoned by the few remaining friends she had. Her quiet life in seclusion became a prison of her own making as she faced the consequences of her actions, not just from her daughter, but from the community that had once supported her. Her heart broke, not only for the pain she had caused, but for the realization that she had lost everything: her dignity, her family, and the only true love she had ever known. As for Edward, the truth of his affair was now laid bare for all to see. The whispers that once seemed like shadows now became accusations, and the guilt he felt for betraying his wife became a heavy burden to carry. But it was the loss of his reputation, the destruction of his career, that truly stung. He had worked so hard for so long to build something meaningful, only for it to crumble in the wake of his own choices. In his quest for passion, he had destroyed his life. The consequences of vengeance, the unraveling of a bitter soul. The echo of Charlotte's vengeful actions reverberated through Valeshire long after the dust of the initial storm had settled. At first, there had been a sense of grim satisfaction, the kind of cold relief that one feels when the scales of justice tip, seemingly in their favor. But as the weeks bled into months, Charlotte began to realize something profound. The satisfaction of revenge is fleeting, and its aftermath lingers far longer than the wounds it was meant to heal. Charlotte had made sure Edward's name was tarnished, his business destroyed, and his relationships reduced to rubble. She had meticulously woven a tapestry of deceit that left no room for him to salvage anything. Every contract he had worked so hard for was now void. Every colleague who had once considered him a trusted partner now saw him through the lens of scandal. His reputation, once pristine, was now a shadow of its former self, a ghost that haunted every decision he made. But what Charlotte didn't anticipate was the toll it would take on her own soul. At first, she relished in the sight of Edward's suffering, his inability to turn back time to fix the pieces of his broken life. She watched him sink deeper into despair, feeling the sting of each lost opportunity, each severed connection. But over time, her satisfaction turned bitter, like the taste of ashes in her mouth. What had been a fire of righteous rage now smoldered, with a cold emptiness. As for Beatrice, the damage was even more profound. The older woman, once so graceful and dignified, found herself an outcast in the very town she had helped build. Friends who had once called her family turned their backs. The whispers, like snakes in the grass, reached her in the solitude of her home. Her heart, already broken by the choices she had made, now bled with the knowledge that her daughter, the one person she had tried so hard to protect, had been the one to cast her into the abyss. Beatrice had never anticipated this level of cruelty from Charlotte. She had thought that, by leaving Edward and retreating into her own guilt, she was sparing everyone further heartache. But in doing so, she had made herself the perfect target. Charlotte, in her bitterness, had not only torn apart Edward's life, but had taken her mother's dignity as well. Beatrice spent her days in the quiet of her home, pondering her choices. She had loved Edward once, deeply, and passionately, but she knew now that love alone was not enough to justify the harm it had caused. What did it mean to love someone? She wondered if that love led to betrayal and destruction. Her heart weighed heavily with regret, but it was a regret tinged with the acceptance that perhaps there was no way to undo the damage. For Edward, the pain of his downfall was compounded by his love for Beatrice, the woman he had once shared such intimacy with. He had betrayed Charlotte, yes, but his affair with Beatrice had been rooted in the same unspoken need for validation and connection that had once driven him to her. Now, with everything lost, he found himself alone in the wreckage of his own making, wondering if he had ever truly understood love at all. But the cost of vengeance is rarely fully understood in the heat of the moment, and it was only when Charlotte began to see the reflection of her own actions in the mirror of her solitude that the true weight of her choices began to crush her. One evening, as autumn began to settle in and the town of Valeshire prepared for another long, quiet winter, Charlotte sat alone in her mansion, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth. Her fingers nervously traced the rim of her wine glass, her mind replaying the events that had led her to this moment. She thought of Edward, of how she had once loved him with all her heart, of how she had trusted him completely, only to watch as he betrayed her in the most intimate of ways. And then she thought of Beatrice, the woman who had once been a second mother to her, a woman whose love for Edward had destroyed everything. But what had it all brought her? The riches she had fought for were now empty. The reputation she had so carefully maintained was shattered. And, worst of all, the peace she had sought through revenge had eluded her. As she sat there, the door creaked open, and in walked her daughter, whom she had not seen in months. The girl was no longer the innocent child who had once looked up to her mother for guidance. She was older now, her eyes hardened by the weight of the world, and her voice carried the unmistakable edge of someone who had seen too much, too soon. "I think we both know what's happened here, Mother," her daughter said, her tone quiet but firm. "You thought revenge would fix things. You thought that punishing them would somehow make you whole again. But all it's done is hollow you out." Charlotte met her gaze, but no words came. She had no defense. The price of vengeance. A heart's last reckoning months had passed since Charlotte's ruthless retaliation had turned her world upside down. The air in Valeshire had grown colder, the town's quaint charm now tinged with an air of melancholy, like a lingering fog that refused to lift. Charlotte's mansion, once a symbol of her power and control, now stood like a hollow monument to the wreckage she had caused. The distant cries of regret were drowned out by the deafening silence that filled every room. Charlotte had seen the fruits of her vengeance. Edward's life ruined, Beatrice exiled from the only place she had ever truly called home. But now, with the satisfaction of revenge slowly fading, a gnawing emptiness had taken its place. No matter how many times she replayed the scenes in her mind, how she had expertly dismantled Edward's reputation, how she had driven Beatrice away, nothing could fill the hollow space within her heart. She had won, but what had she truly gained? In the stillness of one particular night, as the wind howled against the windows, Charlotte found herself alone with her thoughts, lost in the labyrinth of her own mind. She could no longer ignore the truth. Her actions had not restored her dignity, but stripped her of it. And yet, what she had destroyed seemed irreparable. Her family was broken, her marriage shattered, her soul fractured. But even in the deepest despair, Charlotte realized something that had long been clouded by her thirst for revenge. The one thing she had never considered, the one thing that might allow her to heal, was forgiveness. It wasn't just forgiveness of Edward or Beatrice that she needed, but forgiveness of herself. But as the realization dawned upon her, another dark thought crept into her mind. What if they never forgave me? What if I never could make things right? She had come so far in her pursuit of vengeance, and now the road back seemed so distant, so impossible. How could she face them again? How could she ask for forgiveness when she knew she had been the one to burn the bridges? Beatrice, too, was grappling with her own inner turmoil. The consequences of her affair with Edward had destroyed everything she had ever known. Once beloved by the people of Valeshire, she was now a shadow in their eyes, a woman who had betrayed the most sacred trust of all. Her days were spent in isolation, in quiet contemplation of the choices she had made and the inevitable destruction they had wrought. But in her heart, Beatrice knew something Charlotte had yet to understand. Revenge could never fill the void left by betrayal. It only deepened the wound, embedding it further into the soul. What was once love had now become a battleground, and Beatrice realized that, even as she had retreated to protect herself, she too had been consumed by bitterness. As the cold winter began to thaw and the first signs of spring kissed the earth with a soft warmth, Beatrice made a decision. She could not undo the past, but she could try to heal from it. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to reach out to Charlotte, to bridge the chasm of pain that separated them. She did not expect absolution, nor did she expect Charlotte to forgive her. But Beatrice needed to try. It was the only path left. Meanwhile, Edward had been in a quiet corner of Valeshire, still struggling to rebuild his life after the destruction of his career and reputation. His pride had been shattered in ways he had never thought possible, and though the pieces of his former life seemed irretrievably broken, there was one thing that gnawed at him more than the loss of his business: the thought of Charlotte, the woman he had once loved. In the dark hours of the night, he would often remember her smile, the way her eyes would light up when they talked about the future, the life they had planned together. And now, that future was nothing but a memory, a dream that had been shattered by his own reckless choices. He had not forgiven himself for his affair with Beatrice, nor for the devastation it had caused. But what hurt more was the realization that he had once taken Charlotte for granted, had treated her as if she was just another part of his life, rather than the center of it. Now he was left with nothing but regret. But even amid his own suffering, Edward could not escape the truth. Forgiveness was the only way forward. And yet, in the face of the pain he had caused Charlotte, he couldn't help but wonder if he, too, would be forgiven. The winds of change began to stir, not just in the town of Valeshire, but in the hearts of the three individuals who had once been bound by love, now torn apart by betrayal and the pursuit of revenge. One fateful evening, as dusk settled over the horizon, Charlotte stood on the balcony of her mansion, her eyes searching the landscape as though seeking some sign of redemption. She had made her decision. It began with a sensation, a nagging itch just beneath the skin of my consciousness, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. For 10 years, I had built a life with Sarah, a life I believed was steadfast and secure. But as I stood in our kitchen, one rainy November evening, the air thick with the scent of simmering tomato soup, that gnawing unease finally demanded my attention. The first clue came not from a blatant revelation, but from a subtle inconsistency, a discrepancy in her routine. She had returned home late from work, her explanation plausible, yet her demeanor slightly off. Her eyes, usually so direct, seemed to skitter away from mine, and her smile lingered a fraction too long, as if forced into place. Am I imagining this? I wondered, stirring the soup with deliberate slowness, trying to suppress the sudden spike of doubt in my chest. Days turned into weeks, and my unease grew roots. I began to notice things I had previously dismissed. The late-night text messages she claimed were from her boss, the faint trace of cologne that wasn't mine clinging to her scarf, the way her laughter seemed lighter when she was on her phone. Each detail, small on its own, formed a mosaic of suspicion that I couldn't ignore. One evening, as Sarah sat across from me at the dinner table, Her gaze fixed on her plate, I decided to test the waters. "How's work been lately?" I asked casually, taking a sip of my wine. Her fork paused mid-air, her lips parting as if she were about to say something, then closing again. Finally, she murmured, "Busy, as always. Busy." The word echoed in my mind like a taunt. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but inside, my thoughts churned. If she's hiding something, I need to know. It wasn't until I found myself alone one Sunday afternoon, Sarah having gone out for what she claimed was a yoga class, that I decided to act. My hands trembled as I opened her laptop, a device she rarely used in my presence. The screen illuminated, revealing a desktop background of a serene beach we'd visited years ago. It felt almost intrusive, prying into a space that wasn't mine. But the weight of my suspicions pushed me forward. The evidence, when I found it, was both damning and devastating. Hidden in a folder marked work documents were screenshots of text conversations, emails, even photos. Each file painted a picture of a relationship that had spanned years, interwoven with our own life together. My stomach clenched as I read the words she had written to someone else. Words of affection and longing that I had believed were mine alone. I sat there for what felt like hours, the room growing darker as the sun set outside. My thoughts were a cacophony of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. How could she do this, I thought, my chest tightening with every breath. Wasn't I enough? But even as the questions raced through my mind, a part of me felt an almost detached clarity. This was the truth, raw and undeniable, and I couldn't look away. When Sarah returned home that evening, her cheeks flushed from the cold, I watched her carefully. She smiled at me, the same smile that had once lit up my world, and for a moment I felt a pang of longing for the life we had before. But the weight of what I had discovered anchored me in reality. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Her smile faltered, her eyes searching mine for a hint of what was to come. As I began to speak, laying bare the evidence I had uncovered, her expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally, to something resembling guilt. The conversation that followed was painful, raw, and filled with emotions neither of us had anticipated. She tried to explain, to justify her actions, but her words felt hollow against the magnitude of her betrayal. For the first time in our decade together, I saw her not as the woman I loved, but as a stranger, someone capable of shattering the trust we had built. In the days that followed, I grappled with the aftermath of her confession. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground, every corner haunted by memories tainted with doubt. I couldn't help but question everything, every smile, every touch, every moment we had shared. Had it all been a lie? And yet, amidst the pain, I found a flicker of strength. As I stood in front of the mirror one morning, staring at my reflection, I realized that this was not the end of my story. It was a chapter, a painful, pivotal chapter, but not the conclusion. I would heal, rebuild, and rediscover myself, piece by piece. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity, a resolve to move forward. This journey, I knew, would be long and arduous. But as I took my first steps into the unknown, I held on to the hope that, in time, I would find peace and perhaps even happiness once again.